First Boer War, fought between 1880 and 1881, was one of the most surprising military defeats suffered by the British Empire during the 19th century. Although the conflict itself was relatively short, the consequences were significant and long-lasting. A relatively small force of Boer fighters from southern Africa managed to defeat professional British troops in multiple engagements and forced Britain to restore a large degree of independence to the Transvaal. The war exposed weaknesses within the British military system and demonstrated how modern rifles, mobility, and defensive tactics could overcome a larger imperial army still relying on older battlefield methods. While often overshadowed by the much larger Second Boer War that followed nearly 20 years later, the First Boer War remains extremely important because it revealed many of the military realities that would dominate warfare by the early 20th century. The Boers were primarily descendants of Dutch settlers who had lived in southern Africa for generations. Their origins dated back to the 17th century, when the Dutch East India Company established settlements around the Cape of Good Hope. Over time, these settlers developed their own identity, language, and culture. Many lived as farmers and frontier settlers, speaking Afrikaans and practicing Calvinist Christianity. They strongly valued independence, local authority, and self-government. During the 19th century, British influence in southern Africa steadily expanded after Britain took control of the Cape Colony during the Napoleonic Wars. Tensions quickly developed between British authorities and many Boer settlers due to political, economic, and cultural differences. British policies such as the abolition of slavery in 1834 angered many Boers, while disputes over frontier control and British legal authority further increased resentment. As a result, thousands of Boers left the Cape Colony during the period known as the Great Trek during the 1830s and 1840s. Moving inland, they established independent republics beyond direct British control. The two most important of these republics were the South African Republic, also called the Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. These Boer republics saw themselves as sovereign states and strongly resisted outside interference. However, by the late 19th century, southern Africa had become strategically important to the British Empire. Britain wanted greater control over the region for reasons including imperial prestige, trade routes, economic expansion, and concerns about rival European powers. British officials increasingly viewed the independent Boer republics as obstacles to long-term imperial dominance in southern Africa. The immediate origins of the First Boer War can be traced to 1877 when Britain annexed the Transvaal. At the time, the Transvaal government faced economic difficulties and concerns over conflict with neighboring African groups. British officials claimed the republic was unstable and incapable of defending itself properly. Many British politicians believed annexation would stabilize the region and eventually benefit the Boers economically and militarily. However, many Boers viewed the annexation as completely illegitimate. To them, Britain had violated their independence and imposed foreign rule without their consent. Boer resentment steadily increased between 1877 and 1880, as petitions and negotiations with Britain achieved little. One of the most important Boer political leaders during this period was Paul Kruger, who became a major symbol of Boer resistance and later served as president of the South African Republic. At the same time, Britain faced several military and political challenges across southern Africa. The British Empire had recently fought the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879, including the disastrous British defeat at Isandlwana, where an entire British force was destroyed by Zulu warriors. Although Britain eventually defeated the Zulu kingdom, the war exposed weaknesses in British planning and stretched imperial resources in the region. Despite this, British authorities still underestimated the determination and military capability of the Boers. Many assumed that any rebellion would be minor and easily suppressed by professional British troops. This assumption would prove to be a major mistake. In December 1880, Boer resistance finally became open rebellion. Boer leaders declared the restoration of the South African Republic and rejected British authority within the Transvaal. The Boers rapidly organized military forces known as commandos. Unlike European standing armies, Boer commandos were not professional military units. Instead, they were primarily made up of armed civilians, especially farmers, who brought their own horses, rifles, ammunition, and supplies. Many Boer men already possessed years of experience with firearms and mounted travel due to frontier life and hunting. This gave Boer forces several major advantages, including mobility, marksmanship, flexibility, and local terrain knowledge. Boer fighters generally avoided rigid discipline and preferred decentralized leadership and individual initiative. One of the most important aspects of the war was the major difference between Boer and British military tactics. The British Army of the late 19th century still relied heavily on traditional battlefield methods developed earlier in the century. British infantry often fought in close formations and carried out frontal assaults directed through strict command structures. These tactics could work effectively against poorly armed opponents, but they became extremely dangerous against accurate modern rifle fire. The Boers fought very differently. Boer commandos used cover, long-range rifle fire, skirmishing tactics, and rapid mounted movement. Instead of standing in open lines, Boer fighters concealed themselves behind rocks, hills, and natural terrain. Their emphasis on accurate shooting became one of the defining features of the war. Many Boers were experienced hunters capable of effective fire at long distances, while British troops often remained exposed during attacks. The first major engagement of the war occurred on December 20, 1880 at Bronkhorst-Spruit. A British column under Lieutenant Colonel Philip Anstruther was marching through the Transvaal when it encountered Boer forces. The Boers demanded that the British halt their movement, but negotiations quickly failed. Boer fighters then opened fire at relatively close range. The results were devastating for the British column. Within minutes, large numbers of British soldiers were killed or wounded, officers were hit early, and unit cohesion collapsed. The British suffered extremely heavy casualties while Boer losses remained light. The battle shocked British authorities and demonstrated that the rebellion would not be easily defeated. It also highlighted the effectiveness of Boer marksmanship and battlefield tactics. Following the outbreak of the rebellion, Boer forces surrounded several British garrisons across the Transvaal. These sieges isolated British troops and severely limited British operational mobility within the region. Although many of the sieges involved relatively small forces, they placed major pressure on British authority in the Transvaal. Britain now needed reinforcements to restore control. Major General George Pomeroy Colley became one of the key British commanders responsible for responding to the rebellion. British strategy focused on relieving besieged garrisons and re-establishing imperial authority. However, British commanders continued underestimating Boer defensive capabilities and believed disciplined infantry assaults could still overcome Boer positions. One of the most significant battles of the war occurred at Laing's Nek on January 28, 1881. Laing's Nek was a mountain pass controlling access between Natal and the Transvaal. Boer forces occupied strong defensive positions overlooking the area while British troops attempted to force their way through. British forces launched frontal assaults uphill directly against entrenched Boer positions. The attack quickly encountered serious problems as British infantry advancing uphill came under accurate rifle fire from concealed Boer marksmen. British cavalry units also struggled in the difficult terrain. The Boers maintained strong defensive cohesion while British assaults became disorganized under heavy fire. The result was a clear Boer victory. British casualties were substantial while Boer losses remained relatively low. The battle demonstrated how difficult conventional assaults had become against modern rifle fire and defensive positions. Another engagement soon followed at Schuenschucht, also known as Ingogo. British forces again faced major problems caused by terrain, Boer mobility, and accurate rifle fire. The battle occurred during poor weather conditions, further complicating British operations. Although the engagement was somewhat indecisive tactically, British forces suffered heavy casualties and failed to gain momentum. British morale continued to decline as Boer confidence increased. The decisive battle of the war took place at Majuba Hill on February 27, 1881. Majuba Hill overlooked Boer positions near Laing's Nek. General Colley decided to occupy the summit, believing the high ground would provide a major strategic advantage. Initially, British forces successfully reached the top of the hill, but the British position contained serious weaknesses. Defensive preparations were limited, troop positions remained exposed, and coordination was poor. The Boers responded aggressively and used the terrain extremely effectively. Boer fighters climbed the slopes using cover while maintaining accurate rifle fire against British troops above them. Instead of conducting rigid assaults, Boer fighters advanced in small groups and exploited weak points in the British position. British troops became increasingly disorganized under sustained fire, and eventually the line collapsed. Many soldiers retreated in confusion, while others were killed attempting to escape. General Colley himself was killed during the battle. Majuba Hill became one of the most humiliating defeats suffered by Britain during the Victorian era and badly damaged British prestige throughout the empire. Several major factors contributed to the British defeat during the First Boer War. British authorities consistently underestimated Boer military capability and political determination. Many assumed the Boers lacked the discipline or organization necessary for effective warfare, but this proved completely incorrect. Boer marksmanship was consistently superior due to years of hunting experience and familiarity with firearms. Terrain also played a major role. The Boers understood the landscape far better than British troops and used mounted mobility to reposition quickly, avoid unnecessary engagements, and exploit weaknesses. British battlefield tactics were also increasingly outdated. Traditional frontal assaults became highly dangerous against accurate modern rifles, while the Boers demonstrated the growing importance of cover, concealment, and dispersed formations. These lessons would later become extremely important during the Second Boer War and eventually during the First World War. After the defeat at Majuba Hill, the British government reconsidered the situation. Prime Minister William Gladstone was less committed to aggressive imperial expansion than some earlier British leaders and concluded that continuing the war would be politically and militarily costly. Peace negotiations soon followed. Under the Pretoria Convention of 1881, the Transvaal regained self-government while Britain retained limited oversight. For the Boers, the war represented a major political and military victory. For Britain, it represented an embarrassing setback that exposed weaknesses in imperial military strategy. Although short, the First Boer War had major long-term consequences. The conflict exposed serious weaknesses in British tactics and training, while demonstrating how modern rifles increasingly favored defensive warfare. Military observers recognized that traditional formations were becoming obsolete, and that mobility, cover, and marksmanship would dominate future battlefields. The Boer victory also strengthened Boer nationalism and increased confidence within the Boer republics. However, the tensions between Britain and the Boer states did not disappear. In fact, many of the underlying issues remained unresolved. Political rivalry, imperial ambitions, and economic interests would continue to push Britain and the Boer republics toward another confrontation. Then came one of the most important developments in southern African history, the discovery of massive gold deposits in the Transvaal during the 1880s. Suddenly, the Boer republics were no longer just isolated farming states on the edge of the British Empire. They now controlled some of the richest gold fields in the world. British interest in the region intensified dramatically, imperial tensions increased, and relations between Britain and the Boer republics steadily deteriorated throughout the following years. The First Boer War may have ended with a Boer victory and temporary independence, but the conflict between the British Empire and the Boer republics was far from over. Within less than 2 decades, southern Africa would once again descend into war, only this time on a far larger and far more devastating scale. The Second Boer War would become one of the most brutal conflicts of the pre-First World War era and would completely reshape the future of southern Africa and the British Empire itself.